Hilchos Shvisas Yamtiv Perek Chamishi, the laws of resting on holiday, chapter 5. Today, we're going to address 3 topics in this chapter. Number 1, carrying on holiday. Number 2, giving gifts to other people on Yom Tov. And number 3, the laws of Techumin, the laws of walking outside of a city's borders, as we had in the laws of Shabbat. Now we're going to have it as it relates to holiday. And the reason why it's going to be a little different as it relates to holidays is because on Shabbos, you're not allowed to carry anything. So the whole idea of the Techum applies only to the human being. How far can a person walk? But on holiday, because you can carry stuff, now the laws of Techumin are going to extend to possessions, to belongings, things that you can carry, and to what distance you can carry, and what if they're owned by somebody else and borrowed by you? Who does it follow? Whose Techum do you have to follow? So all these laws are going to be discussed in the last third of today's chapter. So, without further ado, let's begin. Halacha Aleph. Even though, as we've said in chapter 1, the sages permitted us to carry on holiday, even not for the needs of food preparation. Biblically, the only labor we're allowed to perform is things that are involved in the preparation of food. But the sages said, since you're allowed to carry for food preparation, we're going to allow you to carry for any necessity that you might have. Nevertheless, said the sages, it's not a license, a free-for-all. Now you can do whatever you want. There are certain limitations. For example, lo yisa masoyis gedolos kederach shu eisa b'chol. You may not carry big loads, huge loads, on the holiday as you would carry during the weekday. Ela tzarich l'shanos. Rather, if you carry a big load, you must do some kind of change to show that you're making it different than a regular day. If it's only if it's impossible to make a change, then mutar, then is it allowed to carry those big loads even on the holiday. Ketzad, what does that look like? Hamevi kadeh yayin mimakim l'makim. If somebody is transferring jugs of wine, as in the picture, guy's carrying a massive box full of wine from place to place. Lo yeviem besal uvekupa. You should not transfer them as you normally would in a basket or in a box. Avol mevihu al kseifa lefanav. What you should do is carry it on your shoulder, carry it in front of you. It's not so comfortable to carry a big box in front of you. So that's a way of showing that you're doing a change for the holiday. If somebody is transferring straw, lo yafshel sakupa la'acharav, he shouldn't throw the box over his back and carry it as you would a regular load on the weekday. Instead, transfer it in your hand, carry it in front of you to show that you're doing this change for the holiday. Halacha beis v'chein masuos or masoos shadarkan lisa oisan b'moit. Similarly, loads that are normally carried on a pole. Instead of carrying them on the pole, suspending them over the pole, simply carry them on your back behind you. Those loads that are not carried on a pole, they're actually typically carried on your back. Put them on your shoulder. The ones that are normally carried on a shoulder, should be carried on holiday in your hand in front of you. Or spread a cloth over the load if you have to carry it on your shoulder. And anything similar that can be made as an act of difference, of change from the regular way of carrying the load. If there is no possible way to make a change from the usual way you carry this load, as we said, you've done your effort, you've looked for the ways, you didn't find them, carry it and transfer the stuff as you normally would. When or all of these laws in the last 2 halachot talked about benoisei al ha'adam, if it's the human being carrying the load. Aval al gabe behema, but if we're talking about transferring loads on an animal, lo yavi klal. There is no license at all on the holiday to do that. No carrying on the animal. Shelo yaseh kederach shu eisa b'chol, so you don't end up doing things the way you would normally do it on a weekday. Carrying loads on an animal is literally a weekday activity. We stay away from that on the holiday. Halacha Gimel, talking about animals, ein manhigin es habehema b'makil. We may not lead an animal in the street, on the road, in your yard, with a stick. Ve'ein hasuma yotzei b'makloi. A blind person may not go out on the holiday carrying his helping stick. V'loi haroya betarmiloi, nor may a shepherd go out with his shepherd's sack. Ve'ein yotzin b'kisei. We may not go out with a chair, more commonly in English called a litter or a sedan chair. This was customary typically for royalty or for important people who didn't have the time or the patience or the necessity to walk in the street. They would have servants who would carry them on a chair. So, ein yotzin b'kisei, we do not go out with those chairs that are meant for loading, echad ha'ish ve'echad ha'isha, whether we're talking about a man or we're talking about a woman. Other texts have, instead of echad with a dalid, achar ha'ish ve'achar ha'isha. We don't go out with a chair behind accompanying a certain important man, prestigious man, or a prestigious woman. Either way, the reason is we don't use these chairs, these litters, so you don't end up acting the way you act on the weekday. But if it was a man who was needed by the public, then you can go out with a chair behind him, if you can carry him out on your shoulders, even in, that's actually the more proper word for the litter, the more fancier word, as we see over here. This is actually a chair. You have a litter, is like a, more of a covered chamber where you would be able to sit there. You can even take him out in that, since you're not doing it for his personal needs, you're doing it because the public needs him to be transported from one place to another. Halacha dalet. Ein melichin es hasulam shel shoivach. You may not move the ladder leading to a birdhouse, mishoivach l'shoivach b'rshus harabim, from one birdhouse to another in the public domain. Shema yemru, because people witnessing you carrying the ladder, they're going to say, you're not carrying it from a birdhouse to a birdhouse. They don't see the two birdhouses. All they see you is carrying a ladder. All they see is you carrying a ladder. They're going to say, Shema yemru, perhaps they're going to say, L'sakin gagli hu melicha. This guy's carrying his ladder to fix his roof. Now, fixing your roof is certainly forbidden on the holiday. People are going to suspect you of doing something forbidden. Avol b'rshus hayachid, but in the private domain, if you have two birdhouses in your backyard, melicha, you can move the ladder from one birdhouse to the other. Afal pi. Now this seems to contradict the basic principle. Afal pi, even though we typically say, Shekol makom she'asru chachamim mipnei maris ha'ayin, any place where the sages made a decree because of what it might lead to on behalf of a person watching, afilu bechadrei chadarim asur, even in rooms within rooms, it's forbidden. The sages didn't say it's only forbidden to do it in public. If the reason for a decree is because of what's called marit ayin, we're worried that people might mistakenly make conclusions based on what they see. The sages forbade it all across the spectrum, even if you're in private. So over here, how come we're saying that only in the public you can't carry the ladder, but in private you could? Here the sages overrode their own decree because of the joy of holiday. We don't want you to be stopped from enjoying the holiday. Perhaps you need to move the ladder from one birdhouse to the other to get a bird, to slaughter a bird, to feed a bird, whatever, somehow to enhance the joy of your holiday. We don't want to mitigate the joy of the holiday, and so you're allowed to move the ladder so long as it's in the private domain. Halacha hey, misha hayulei peres al gagai. If somebody had fruit or produce on his roof, and he needed to move them to somewhere else. On holiday, a need arose to move them, as the commentaries explain, based on the Talmud. You saw rain was going to come, might destroy the fruits, or some other reason you needed to have guests on your roof. There was no room for them with the produce. Lo yeshite migag legag. You may not transfer the produce on the roof from one roof to another. Va'afilu bagagin hashavin, even if the two roofs are on equal level ground. V'lo yishalshalem bechevel min hachalonos, neither may you lower them with a rope from the windows onto the outside. V'lo yaridem besulamash, nor may you take them off the roof by ladders. Shelo yaseh kederech shu'esa b'chol, all this so you don't do things the way you do them during the week. Aval mashilon, what you may do though is you may lower them into the home which the roof is covering. You may lower them, and actually some say mashilon means throw them down. Afilu derech aruba, even by way of the skylight, mimakim lemakim ba'isei hagag. Even if you need to transfer them from place to place on the roof, so you take your apples to the skylight. This is a pretty small roof. Let's say you had a big roof, and you're moving your apples all the way to the skylight. As long as you're throwing them down into the house, that's okay. Shachad behema basadeh, if you slaughtered an animal in the field, away from where you're going to eat it, away from your home, lo yevi'ena b'moit la'ir. Oy b'moita, you may not bring it whole, as they typically would do during the week, to the city, on a pole or a double pole, as some translate the word moita, some have the word mita instead of moita, on a bed, like a type of stretcher that you would put the animal's body on. Do not bring it back whole. That's a weekday activity. Elamavia evarim evarim. What you could do is you can bring it limb by limb. Slaughter the animal outside the city, you cut it up into whatever pieces you're going to have, and then bring the pieces slowly but surely back to your house. Halacha vav. Now we move on to the laws of gifting. Kol shenei oisin bay afilu b'choil. Any product which you could make use of even during the week, but you can make use of it right away. It doesn't require preparation. Afal pi she'einei oisin bay b'yamtiv. Even if it's something which, for other reasons, you cannot make use of on the holiday. It could go in tefillin, for example, tefillin. If I give you a pair of tefillin on the weekday, you can make use of it right away. Technically, on the holiday, you won't put it on for a different reason, but it's something usable, doesn't require preparation. Mutar l'shalchan lechavere b'yamtiv. You can send it to a friend as a gift on holiday. Needless to say, if it's something which you can actually make use of on the holiday, like wine, oil, flour, that's for sure permitted to be sent as a gift. But if it's something which you would not be able to use during the week, unless you do some preparatory act, and this preparatory act, not just any preparatory act, it's an act, something which is forbidden to do on the holiday, as the Rambam will immediately give an example, then we may not send it as a gift on the holiday because the person won't be able to benefit from it on the holiday, and so in effect, you're sending him something which he'll only be able to use after the holiday, and you're doing labor on the holiday for the needs of after the holiday, which is forbidden. Ketzad, says the Rambam, halacha zayin. What does that look like? What does it mean? Something that you would need to do an act of preparation that's forbidden on the holiday. Ein meshalchin b'yamtiv tvua. You may not send raw produce, raw grain, to a friend on the holiday. Because even on a weekday, if you wanted to make use of, let's say, the wheat or the barley which you sent, you can only use it elaim kein tochan, unless you ground the kernels. And grinding is an act which is forbidden on the holiday. But you could send legumes because all you have to do is cook them in order to use them on the holiday or toast them, and that's allowed on holiday. You're allowed to do things that are immediately preparing food. Cooking and toasting is okay. You can even send undomesticated animals or domesticated animals or birds, even if they're alive, because you're allowed to slaughter the animal on the holiday that's directly preparing food, as we saw 2 days ago. And therefore, it's sending something which, while it needs preparation, it's permitted preparation on the holiday. And anything similar would also go under this rubric of when you can send it as a gift and when you cannot. Halacha ches. Kol davar shemuter l'shalche b'yamtiv. Anything which I'm allowed to send as a gift on holiday. Kishe yishlachenu lechaveri teshura. If and when I do choose to send this thing to my friend as a gift. Lo yishlachenu b'shura. You shall not send it in a shura. A shura was a line. It was a series of people, a chain of people who would bring the gift, and it was a way of showing your honor to the person that you're gifting it. And it makes a lot of noise, a lot of publicity involved. So you don't send gifts with a shura, with a row. The ein shura pchusa mishleisha b'nei adam. In order for the series, for the chain to qualify as a shura, it has to be at least 3 people. So less than 3 people, that's okay. You can send it with a group of 2, but not with a group of 3 or more. Ketzal, what does that look like practically? Let's say you send to your friend a bunch of animals or a bunch of different types of wine. In the hands of 3 different people, or 4, one after the other, and they're all walking in one row, in one line, to your home. That's forbidden. So you don't do things that you would usually do in the weekday. But if you send 3 different types of foods or gifts in the hands of 3 different people, even if they came together as one, hareza mutar, it's permitted. Now, before I said the reason for the shura is because it's too much publicity or it's weekday activity. Some of the commentaries actually explain it's related to what we learned the other day about business. If you see a row of people carrying a bunch of the same product, you assume that they're all going to the market to sell it. And that could lead to some mistaken conclusions. And that's why if you have 3 or more people carrying different products, it doesn't look like they're all going to one destination. It looks like they're all going to different destinations, not the market. That's allowed. Halacha tes. Now we begin to talk about the tichum. As we saw in the laws of Shabbat, when you have a city, a person is allowed to walk 2,000 amot, 2,000 cubits, about 3,000 feet outside of the city's limits. Past there, you're not allowed to walk unless you make an eruv techumin, unless you put food at a certain distance, and that allows you to walk another 2,000 amot. So, says the Rambam, when it comes to the laws of holiday, as I mentioned in the beginning of the chapter, there's an additional complication. When somebody makes an eruv techumin, he puts food down at a point beyond the city limits, and he declares that's where he's accepting the holiday, and from there he'll be able to walk an additional 2,000 amot in each direction. On the holiday, all of your animals, all of your utensils, all of your produce, anything that belongs to you becomes like you. And you can only transfer them only within 2,000 amot, 2,000 cubits from wherever you placed your eruv down. Halacha Yud, Cheftzei Hefker, ownerless objects. Nobody owns them. On the holiday, they become like the feet. In other words, they become subject to the same rules as the person who acquires them. Somebody picks up a jug of water that was ownerless on the holiday. He can take this jug of water only where he is allowed to walk on the holiday. The Cheftzei HaKusim, objects belonging to non-Jews, Kainin Shvisas b'Mekayman. They acquire their state of Shabbos wherever they are in the moment that the holiday enters. They can be transferred 2,000 amot in every direction from the place in which they began the holiday. The rabbis decreed on objects that have Gentile owners because of objects that have Jewish owners. And they said, even though typically Gentiles aren't even subject to the laws of the whole tichun business, but because you might mix it up with a Jewish-owned object, so we said all objects can only be transferred from wherever they are, 2,000 amot. Produce that left their place, somebody moved them on the holiday, and then came back to the place within their 2,000 amot. Afilu b'meized, even if it was done purposely, lo yifsidu es mekayman, they do not lose their initial position. They are compared to a person who was forcefully brought out of the tichum and then brought back in, as we saw in the laws of Shabbat, chapter 27. When somebody is forcefully taken out of the tchum and then brought back in, it's as though he never left. And so, since produce obviously can't take a walk on its own, so whoever moves the produce is considered to be dictating its whatever happens to it, so it's considered forced. Yud Aleph, HaMoiser Behemte Livnai. If somebody hands off his animal to his son, doesn't mean it changes owners. Harehi Keragli Ha'av. Its power of transfer remains subject to the feet of the father, the original owner of the animal. As far as the father can walk, that's as far as the animal can be taken by the son on holiday. But if the owner of the animal gave it over to a shepherd, even if he only gave the animal on holiday, now it assumes the status like the feet of the shepherd. And wherever the shepherd is allowed to walk on the holiday, the animal can be taken on the holiday. Because when you hand it off to a shepherd, you're really handing off the ownership, at least for the day, and it assumes his status. If you give over the animal to the deposit, to the watch, to the safekeeping of two shepherds, now there's no one shepherd you can point to and say, he's the guy we're going to follow with the status, because you gave it to two. So actually, no transfer happens. It remains subject to the feet of the original owners. Because neither one of the shepherds can say, I acquired the animal. Nobody acquired it, and so the rights remain with the original owner. Yud Beis, Misha Zimin Etzle Urchim B'Yamtiv. If somebody invited guests to be by him, to eat by him on the holiday, Lo Yelichu B'Yadam Manois L'Makayim She'ein Baal HaSu'uda Yachal Elech Bay. They cannot take portions of food, leftovers from the meal, to a place where the owner of the meal would not be able to go. Let's say the owner is living in the city. He could only walk 2,000 amot out of the city. He didn't make an eruv. These guests live in the next city, but they did make an eruv. So they're allowed to walk to their eruv plus 2,000 amot. That's how they were able to reach this host's house. But when they walk back, if they're going to walk back to their eruv and then to their home, they're actually walking past a place where the original owner of the meal he's not allowed to walk. So you can't take your food with him either. Shekol asuda kiragle bal asuda. Because the entirety of a meal follows the feet, follows the status of the owner of the meal. Lo kiragli ha'orchin, not the feet of the guest. Ela im kain, with one exception, unless if already before the holiday, the owner of the meal told somebody else, here, pick up this portion on behalf of my guests that are coming tomorrow. Thereby you've already handed off the rights to the food before the holiday began to your guests. Now, when the meal is over, they can take this leftover portions of food back to their home, even though the owner of the home would not be able to walk there, but because it was already handed off to them before the holiday, they can take it as though it's their own, and the food follows their status, not the status of the owner of the meal. Yud Gimel, a similar case. Similarly, if somebody had produce deposited in another city, the members of that city made an eruv, which allows them to come to the area where the owner of the produce is living. But he did not make an eruv, so he can't walk there. They cannot bring his produce with them on the holiday. Because the produce sitting in the other city follows your own status. You didn't make an eruv, you can't walk there. Even though the produce currently finds itself in the hands of people who did make an eruv and could walk further, but the produce follows the original owner. When do we say this? If, when the man originally deposited the produce in the other city, he designated a corner where they're going to be. So he has a place that he can call his own. But if he simply brought the produce, never designating a place for his produce, he handed it off to them and said, do whatever you want with it, put it wherever you want, now it becomes like theirs. The fruit, the produce, assume the status, they become like the feet of the one by whom the fruit was deposited by, and therefore in the case mentioned above, if they made an eruv to come back to this town, they are allowed to bring some of the produce with them because the produce follows their status. Yudalit, Ber Shel Yochid, a water pit. This is an ancient water pit. It doesn't look so clean, but imagine if you could kind of line the sides of the pit with some proper lime or plaster, and you fill it up with water, you can actually drink from it. So if it's a pit which belongs to an individual, kiragle bailov, any water lifted from the pit follows the feet, follows the status of the owner of the pit. You can only take the water as far as the owner can go. If it's a city, if it's a water pit that belongs to the city, kiragle anshe, it would go by the feet, by the status of a regular member of the city. A regular member of the city can walk to the city border plus 2,000 amot. That's how far you can take the water from this pit. If it's the pits that are to be found on the sides of the road, for those ascending from Babylonia, that are actually handed off to the public, they don't belong to a specific city, they belong to the public. But Olei Bavel is pilgrims, people that are coming up from Babylonia to the Holy Temple, to Jerusalem, to Israel, for the 3 holidays. They made pits on the side of the road for people that were traveling to get a drink on their way when they get thirsty. So they have no specific owner. So then, they follow the water lifted from these pits, follow the status, the feet of whoever fills up the water. So every cup will have a different status. Any person who fills up water from these public pits, can take the water to wherever he's allowed to go. Rivers that flow, streams that are flowing, they go by the feet of every person who uses them. If the flow of the river began somewhere outside of the border of the city limits and coming in to the city limits, it doesn't matter. You can fill water from this river on Shabbat if you're in the city limits. Certainly on the holiday when you're allowed to carry, there's no problem. We don't say, oh, the water came from a place outside of the tchum. We don't look at it that way. The water's flowing, it's here in front of you, now it achieves the status that relates to you. Tesvav, Shor Shel Rayeh, an ox belonging to a shepherd, to a person who's in charge of a herd, the local herd. He gathers animals from different owners in the city, and then ultimately he sells them off for slaughter. Kiragle anshe oisa ha'ir. The oxen, if they're sold, can only be transferred by the feet, like the status of a regular city owner, a regular city member. Wherever he can walk to the city's borders plus 2,000 amot, that's where you can take it. And we'll soon contrast this, you'll understand better, with the next law. V'sher shel patam. If it's an ox belonging to a fattener was a person who would make these unique animals. He would fatten them, prepare them to be really, really juicy, and then sell them off for slaughter. So then, if you buy from him, it follows the feet of whoever buys it to slaughter it on the holiday. Why is that? Because the mind, the intent of the original owner of the animal who handed it off to the fattener is he wants to sell his animal to whoever will buy it, even if it's somebody outside of the city. Because it's a fattened animal. Everybody hears about it. It's very unique. Everybody wants to come buy it. That's where you see the contrast now. When it's a regular city herder, he doesn't have anything unique about his animals. So whenever you buy the animal, it's confined to wherever the regular city members of that region can walk. But if it's a fattened animal, the owner had in mind that it's going to be sold even to somebody further. And he said, you know what? Whoever buys it will be able to move it wherever he can move. Similarly, a regular animal, a guy slaughters his animal on the holiday, sells the meat. Anybody who buys a portion in the meat, can take his portion to wherever he is able to go. Because that was the intent of the owner of the animal from already before the holiday. That was his plan. That people from even other cities may end up buying his animal. So we're going to treat this ox like the pit, the water pit of the pilgrims of Babylonia, which is handed off to the public. It belongs to nobody in particular. So whoever lifts from it, in this case, whoever takes a piece of meat from the slaughtered animal, can take it wherever he can go. Follows the feet, follows the status of the owner of the coal, not necessarily the person who might be borrowing it. You go after wherever the original owner can go, that's where you can take the coal. But a flame follows the feet or the status of the person who has it in his hand. Therefore, if you light a candle or a piece of wood from your friend's flame, you don't say, oh, since it came from my friend's flame, I can only take this flame where my friend can go. No, you can take your flame to wherever you can go, because the flame follows whoever has it. If somebody borrows an article, a utensil from his friend before the holiday, even if you only handed off the article on the holiday, since the loan was already in place before the holiday, it follows the feet of the borrower. The borrower can take this object wherever he's allowed to go on holiday. But if you only engaged in the loan, you only borrowed the article on the holiday, even though it's your normal habit, every year, every holiday, you borrow this specific utensil from that specific guy, you didn't begin the loan until the holiday began. The article began the holiday in the possession of the lender, so it follows the feet of the lender. If two people borrowed one cloak, one person borrowed the cloak to be used in the morning of the holiday, and the second person borrowed it to use it in the evening. So here we have an unfortunate case, which we actually had a variation of in the laws of Eruvin, and now we're going to repeat it in this context of the holiday. What happens to this cloak is that it now becomes limited by the limits of both borrowers. And they can only transfer it in a place where both have the authority to walk. The Rambam will immediately describe what this looks like, but I want to just take a moment on the screen to show you. When a person makes an eruv, putting the food outside of the city, or in this case, outside from the place where the cloak is. When you make an eruv, you do gain bonus points. Let's say here, you made the eruv 1,000 amas away. Now you can walk an additional 2,000 for a total of 3,000 that way. But you also lose points. Because you made your eruv 1,000 amas away, now on this side, you're only able to walk 1,000 amas. So you gain here, you lose there. Same thing over here. You make an eruv going this way. You gain points there, but you lose there. So if you have two people now borrowing a cloak, and they made eruvs in different directions, we're only going to follow the limitations. We're going to say you can only go to the east where the western guy can go. And you only can go to the west where the eastern guy can go. Says the Rambam Yutes. Ketzah, what does this look like practically? The first guy made his eruv 1,000 amas away to the east of the cloak, as in the picture. And the second guy made his eruv 500 amas to the west of the cloak. When the first guy takes the cloak, so if he was the only guy, so beautiful, he can take his cloak to the east 3,000 amas. But now, because he has to include the limits of the western guy, he can only take the cloak to the east up to 1,500 amas away from the cloak, which is the end of the border, which the person who made the eruv to the west can walk. The guy who made the eruv to the west can only walk 1,500 to the east. When the second guy in the evening takes the cloak, he gets the opposite limitation. He can only take it to the west Ela ad 1,000 amma mimakam hakli, only up to 1,000 amos from the place of the cloak, shehu soif hatchum, sheyachol zeh, she'erev b'mizrach lahalich bay, which is the end of the border, where the guy on the eastern eruv can walk in the west. Lefichach, therefore, in erev zeh, berichok alpayim amma min nechaluk lemizrach. If we have the unfortunate case where the first guy made his eruv 2,000 amos to the east, v'zeh berichok alpayim amma lemayrav, and that guy made his eruv 2,000 amos to the west. So again, if they were each on their own, they gained the maximum amount of points. 2,000 all the way that way, 2,000 all the way that way. But because each of them also loses points in the other direction, i.e., the guy to the east can go nothing to the west, and the guy to the west can go nothing to the east because they pulled their eruv to the maximum, so now the cloak also can go nowhere. One made 2,000 to the east, 2,000 to the west, the cloak, they cannot move it from its place at all. Similarly, a woman, if she borrowed from a friend of hers water or salt to mix into her dishes, and she kneaded a dough with it or cooked a dish with it, this dough or this dish comprised of ingredients belonging to the woman and to her friend are now subject to the limitations of both. And now says the Rambam a fascinating law. Similarly, two people bought an animal in partnership. And slaughtered it on the holiday. Even though after the splitting was done, each person walks away with his portion of meat, all the meat is subject to the limitations of both of them. You can only take it in a place where both of them can go. And we're going to appreciate this more in a moment. But let's say they bought a chavis, a barrel in partnership, and they divided it on the holiday. Here, when they split up the wine, each person can take his portion of wine to wherever he can go. It has no limitations of the other person. Why? Since the whole limitation of walking past the city limits is a rabbinic enactment, yesh bereira bahen. We apply the principle of bereira. Bereira we had also in the laws of Eruvin. It's the idea of retroactive clarification. Now that you split up the wine today, if we consider it as though the portion that reached this person was already clear, designated to him, and distinguished from before the holiday in the barrel. We basically imagine that already before the holiday it was split up, as though it was never mixed up in the first place. Now, if you say that by the wine, why not say bereira by the animal? They bought an animal in partnership, slaughtered it on the holiday, divided it up. Now each person has his piece of meat. Okay, let's just say it's as though each person's piece of meat was already divided from before the holiday. Says the Rambam, you cannot say the same principle by an animal. Why not? Because the portion of meat that the guy is walking away with, even if we're going to consider it to have been separated in the animal from before the holiday, as though it was already clear, but while the animal was still alive, every cell, every limb gets nourished one from the other. When the animal was alive, his portion of meat nurtured itself from the portion of the friend. Because all the animal's limbs nurture one from the other. And it turns out, every limb is mixed with parts of my portion, parts of your portion. And when you divide it on the holiday, it's as though you're dividing it only today. There is no retroactive clarification. And therefore they are subject to the limitations of both, and you can only take the meat to a place where both of them can walk on the holiday.